13 colonies defeated the strongest empire in the world. In the late 18th century, that outcome seemed almost impossible. Britain had the most powerful navy on earth, a professional army, global wealth, and generations of military experience. The American colonies had fewer men, less money, less training, a weak central government, and constant shortages of food, clothing, weapons, and gunpowder. And yet Britain lost. So how did America actually win the Revolutionary War? The answer is not that the colonies crushed the British in battle after battle. In fact, they often lost. The real answer is more surprising. America won by refusing to collapse, by making the war too large, too expensive, and too politically frustrating for Britain to keep fighting, and by turning a colonial rebellion into an international crisis. This is the story of how an underdog revolution survived long enough to win. At the start of the Revolutionary War, Britain seemed unbeatable. It possessed the greatest navy in the world and one of the best trained armies anywhere. It could hire foreign troops, supply large fleets, and draw wealth from a global empire. On paper, the rebellion should have been crushed quickly. The colonies, by contrast, were badly divided. Not all Americans supported independence. Many remained loyal to the crown. The Continental Congress was weak, money was scarce, enlistments were short, and the Continental Army was often poorly supplied. George Washington struggled constantly with shortages. His soldiers often lacked shoes, blankets, food, and ammunition. Desertion was a threat. Disease was a threat. Training was inconsistent. Nearly everything was harder for the Americans than it was for the British. If the war were decided only by raw strength, the revolution should have failed. But wars are not won on paper alone. One of Britain's greatest weaknesses was that it misunderstood the kind of war it was fighting. British leaders often treated the conflict like a conventional rebellion that could be put down by capturing major cities and defeating armies in open battle. But America was not a small uprising in a compact territory. It was a sprawling conflict stretched across a vast continent with rough roads, local militias, shifting loyalties, and enormous distances. The British could take cities like New York and Philadelphia. But holding a city was not the same as controlling the countryside, and controlling the countryside was not the same as breaking the rebellion. Again and again, Britain won tactical victories without achieving strategic success. That became one of the central patterns of the war. Impressive battlefield results that failed to end the fight. George Washington understood the one thing America absolutely had to do. It had to survive. Washington did not need to destroy the British Army in one glorious stroke. He needed to keep the American cause alive. If the Continental Army survived, the Revolution survived. If the army was annihilated, the cause itself might die with it. So Washington often avoided total disaster instead of chasing reckless glory. He retreated when necessary. He preserved his army when he could. He accepted that survival itself was a kind of victory. This did not always look dramatic, and it did not always satisfy critics, but it was strategically brilliant. Washington fought enough battles to prove the revolution still existed, while avoiding the kind of catastrophic defeat that would end everything. In that sense, America's first great military achievement was endurance. Even though the Americans often lost major engagements, a few key victories changed everything. The victories at Trenton and Princeton in the winter of 1776 and 1777 were especially important. After a string of defeats, morale was collapsing. The revolution looked fragile, perhaps even doomed. Then Washington crossed the Delaware, struck Hessian forces at Trenton, and followed with another success at Princeton. These were not the largest battles of the war, but they were psychologically enormous. They revived confidence. They helped keep soldiers re-enlisting. They convinced Americans that the cause was still alive. They showed that Britain could be hit, and hit hard. In a war where morale and legitimacy mattered as much as territory, These victories had consequences far beyond the battlefield. America did not need to look invincible. It needed to look possible. The turning point came at Saratoga in 1777. A British campaign moving south from Canada was supposed to isolate rebellious New England from the rest of the colonies. Instead, British General John Burgoyne became trapped, cut off, and forced to surrender. This was not just an American victory. It was proof that the Americans could defeat a major British army in the field. Proof that the rebellion might actually succeed. Proof that supporting America was no longer a foolish gamble. And that mattered because foreign powers were watching. France, Britain's old rival, had been waiting for evidence that the Americans were worth backing. Saratoga gave them that evidence. After Saratoga, France formally allied with the United States. That transformed the war from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. And once that happened, Britain's problems multiplied dramatically. French support was one of the biggest reasons America won the war. France provided money, arms, ammunition, troops, naval power, and military expertise. The revolution had begun as an American struggle, but it did not end through American effort alone. French assistance was decisive. This is one of the most important truths about the war. The United States won its independence with foreign help. French officers aided the American cause. French soldiers joined the fighting. French ships challenged British control of the seas. French money helped keep the war going when the American government was weak and cash poor. And France was not the only complication Britain faced. Spain and the Dutch Republic also became involved against Britain in the wider conflict. Suddenly, the British Empire was not only dealing with rebellious colonies, it was facing an international war across multiple theaters. That stretched British resources thin and made a clean victory in America far harder to achieve. As the war continued, Britain faced a brutal reality. It could seize ground. It could win impressive battles. It could occupy cities. But none of that guaranteed political control. The British had to conquer a people spread across a huge landscape. They needed loyalist support to rise in large numbers and stabilize British rule. They needed supply lines to function across the Atlantic Ocean. They needed Parliament and the British public to keep paying for the war. And they needed all of this while facing major European rivals elsewhere. That was an enormous burden. Meanwhile, the Americans did not need to conquer Britain. They only needed to make British victory too costly to sustain. The longer the war lasted, the more that reality favored the Americans. Britain's Southern campaign showed this clearly. British leaders believed there was stronger loyalist support in the South and hoped to regain control by moving through Georgia and the Carolinas before sweeping north. At first, the strategy looked promising. But the South became a draining and chaotic struggle. Resistance remained fierce. Fighting became brutal. The Loyalist wave never fully delivered the stability Britain needed. The British could still win battles, but they were still losing the war. That long struggle led to Yorktown in 1781. British General Cornwallis moved his forces to Yorktown, Virginia, where he expected to be supported by the Royal Navy. But that plan failed when the French fleet blocked British naval rescue, while American and French forces trapped Cornwallis on land. The result was decisive. Cornwallis surrendered. Yorktown was not technically the last battle of the war, but it effectively broke British political will. After years of cost, frustration, and expanding conflict, the British government no longer saw victory in America as worth the price. And that is how America won the Revolutionary War. Not by being stronger, not by winning every battle, but by surviving long enough, fighting smart enough, and securing enough help to make imperial victory impossible. The colonies won because Britain could not turn military strength into lasting political control, because geography and distance weakened imperial power, because Washington kept the army alive. because American morale survived repeated defeats, because Saratoga brought France into the war, and because Yorktown made clear that the struggle could continue indefinitely at terrible cost. The strongest empire in the world lost, not because it was weak, but because even great empires have limits. And in the 18th century, 13 colonies found those limits,